we respond to all of this. And so the third season, and this really came up from my fellow curators more than me, and it's been really inspirational, has been, okay, so we seem to be in a perpetual moment of being off balance. We seem to be in a perpetual state of constant disruption. I think of differential calculus, and integrated calculus, for anyone who understands that, as like you're constantly approaching, it's always in a state of change. The mathematics is in a state of change. And math, this thing that is supposed to be very clear and understood, calculus has always failed. I've always failed to understand calculus, but the premise is that it's as things change. How do things change? And with the question that we started to quest on, we started to call ourselves the chaosmonauts, is where is the generative capacity? Where is the moment of creativity? If we were to embrace the feeling of being off balance, if we were to embrace the feeling of being in a state of constant flux and perpetual change, and not be looking always to stabilize and ground ourselves in that change. And as a result, we've had some really lovely conversations. They are all available on the Unrehearsed Futures page on the Drama School Mumbai website, as we wait to get our own independent website. And today, we are graced with and really fortunate to have the presence of Neel Chaudhuri, who is a Delhi-based actor, director, writer, mainly a director and a writer, and has an incredible body of work behind him at this stage. And his journey into theater and his journey into training is completely different. And I think I'm going to be unpacking that with him a little bit in the conversation. But Neel, thank you so much. And thank you for understanding the provocation and come and provoke us. And this conversation will very quickly turn into a conversation in the circle. So I hope you all are ready to participate, because Neel is as much here to provoke as he is to learn with us, because that's what the nature of this space has always been. Neel, welcome.
Thanks, Jahan, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining, and thank you for being here. I think one of the reasons when Jahan proposed this conversation, one of the reasons I was interested in it is because I've spent a majority of the last 2.5 to 3 years primarily working in teaching or training spaces, and less in the space of practice, which is very different from the previous 17 years, where training and teaching spaces sort of punctuated a much longer journey of practice. And so before I get into a few thoughts that I jotted down about this, I just wanted to also tell you a little bit about the context of some of these teaching and training spaces. So there have been 4 primary spaces that I've worked on in the last 3 years. The first is with a theater repertory that's based in Delhi called Agaz. And Agaz is a repertory of young actors from the Nizamuddin Basti, the Nizamuddin neighborhood, who all kind of work together as in a sort of community theater practice that has been around for about 10 years, in which they started off as teenagers, some of them even younger, and now most of them are in their early 20s. The second space is at the Ashoka University, which is just on the outskirts of Delhi, in which I've done 2 types of teaching. One is what's called the co-curricular program. And so it's very much the arts and theater as feeding into their more regular liberal arts curriculum. And these are mostly undergraduate students. And the other is a minor course. So they have a performance arts department at Ashoka University, but it's a minor department. So students can only take the performance arts courses, of which there are a variety, but they can only take them as minors. And most of the students who take the performance arts courses end up being primarily arts majors, psychology, writing, history. The third space is at the National School of Drama in Delhi, where, and this was kind of a one-time engagement where I taught, and at the National School of Drama, most of the teaching is via sort of a theater practice and theater production. So the students learn, and these are their final year students, so they learn during the course of a production. So I directed The Seagull by an adaptation of Chekhov's The Seagull with them earlier this year. And finally, and the most kind of sustained teaching that I've done over the last 2 years has been at Drama School Mumbai, with the current batch that is about to finish next month, I think. This is a blended batch. So I did 6 months with them, playwriting course, and then a few weeks with them in residency 2 months ago, last month, I think. So it's actually the experience of, yes, thanks for correcting me, Jan. The 6 months was online, the playwriting course. It's the sort of cumulative experience of these past 3 years that has coincided with a long pause in the trajectory of my own theatre company that I've worked with for the last 15 years, Tadpole Repertory, where we used or we found ourselves in the first year of the pandemic in a moment of not wanting to rush in to see how to continue practice in this sort of new emerging digital space and hybrid spaces, and actually to use that opportunity to pause and also consider that a part of our journey as a theatre company had ended, and now perhaps this was a moment to reimagine, to renew, and to return with something else. And it's the coincidence of teaching in these 4 very different spaces and this pause that made me interested in today's conversation, primarily because I think I come here with a lot more questions and uncertainty and doubt than I do with anything to share by way of that has any form of sort of certitude or within it. I wanted to start by talking about something that happened 2 days ago. As part of this process of returning to work as Tadpole, the group that I've been with for the last 17 years, is that we've decided to go back to our studio space and really clear it out. So clear out sets and props and costumes from previous productions, and with a view towards kind of returning to kind of an empty space almost. And then inevitably that process, you end up thinking, okay, what do we keep? What do we get rid of? And the question of what do we keep ends up being this big debate. And the other day, we pulled out from the back of our storage these 2 really kind of very simple wooden structures. They're essentially table legs that we've had for about 20 years. And there was just a common understanding that we would keep these 2 things. And today, as I was kind of thinking about what to talk about, I could kind of ask myself that why did we keep these 2 specific things? They're just simple wooden table legs on which you would put a plank of wood, and becomes a table, the kind that sort of carpenters use. And a few things occurred to me, which was that as reasons for why they have survived and been kept is that they are mobile, they take up very little space, they're versatile, and they hold things up. And this is apart from the nostalgic value that we have, because they're also the set of multiple productions of ours. And I reflected on these things as reasons to keep going on with something. And it made a lot of sense to me. The ideas of versatility, the ideas of mobility, the ideas of something that acts as a structure to hold something else up. And these are ideas that I have often returned to, I think, in moments of doubt in the last 2 years, working with students and working with actors. One of the things that Jehan said, which I'll just elaborate on, is my journey as a practitioner. I never formally trained in the theater. My background was actually in film studies, and then I came into the theater from a space that 15 years ago was not uncommon, which is that a sort of amateur theater practice that then in a few years turned into a more, I wouldn't say professional, but a more serious practice, where a more full-time practice. It still happens that a lot of the practitioners that I work with spend most of their time doing other things, including teaching, to earn money in India because of the unorganized, because theater is a sort of unorganized sector in India. And so less time actually practicing, formally practicing theater. And so the other thing that I find myself confronted with now in all these 4 spaces is working with actors as a mentor or as a teacher, working with actors who have far more training than I do already. And that sort of, for me, is a very curious relationship, because I'm teaching them primarily what I have learned through practice, and they are learning all of that. I mean, they are going through that process and accepting it as a certain kind of knowledge system, as a certain kind of pedagogy. And I'm always very frank with them to say that I come from an extremely bastardized pedagogy, that you will find when you work with practitioners, as they often do, who come from very definitive or let's say at least more comprehensive systems, like whether it's Grotowski or whether it's viewpoints or whatever it is, or even sort of more traditional forms like Kalari, and come back to this kind of practice that I work with, and they often find hints and directions and movements from all of these places. And that's because that has been, in some senses, the journey of Tadpole and the journey of myself as a theatre practitioner, which is kind of really sort of pulling in and putting everything on those table legs and using what we needed at any given point. The other thing that I find that I have been, that's very interesting to me in most of these spaces, is that most teaching environments that I've been in seem to have a coincidence of 2 movements at the same time. The first is the movement of kind of learning and teaching, and the second is the movement of production and performance. And it's difficult to separate them or even look at them separately. But the way I see it, and I suppose working at the National School of Drama is the most sort of vivid example of this, is where you're hired actually as a teacher, you're hired to train them, but your actual job is to make a production. And so these 2 things are somewhat happening simultaneously, these 2 objectives. And for me, this is the coincidence or the sort of contrast or even the conflict between these 2 is interesting, because to me, training and practice has always been a very open-ended process, and a process that never ends with something definitive. I mean, that's been my experience. Whereas working towards a sort of fixed production or a series of shows, or a particular teaching goal sometimes has sort of contradicted that movement of mine. And so it's the tension between these two different things that has defined, I think, the experience that for me in the last 2 or 3 years. And Recently in drama school, the other thing that I experienced also at the residency was something that I suppose, only term as a velocity of expectation, which is something I think is new for me, and counter to, in some senses, the place that I find myself in. I think one of the things that was a discovery for me during the pandemic was a discovery of slowness again, and the value of slowness, and duration, and what that actually means in a creative process. Whereas I find that in all the teaching spaces that I've been in, and this I don't think can be entirely blamed on the pandemic, where people feel like they've lost time and they want to come up and catch up as quickly as possible. But it's also something I think which is true of a current kind of generation of students and theater makers, is this velocity of expectation, of the anticipation of arrival, of finding something, of finding themselves somewhere. And how that has, I mean, in a very, at a very simple kind of level, how that translates sometimes in a classroom is this expectation of more definitive or defined or specific criticism, or more fixed points to hit, which has contradicted my instinct, which is to, which again, fed in by my experience of the pandemic, is to give in to duration, and give in to the one thing, the one process that I think defines theater practice for me, which is repetition, which is to keep kind of repeating and to keep doing until you sort of have to stop and say, okay, this is where I am, without identifying that as a particular sort of fixed point or destination, because you have to immediately move on, both in kind of performance work, and also in teaching spaces. Jihan, I know I've kind of rambled on for a bit, but I'm just going to say a couple more things and then we can open it up.
You're giving me a lot of rich stuff to use in my questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So over here, I think the thing that I wanted to pick out is the difference between repetition and interruption. And it has occurred a number of times in the last 2 years, where I find students coming into the space with an expectation of interruption, that I will present myself to the moment, I will apply myself to the exercise, but I am expecting to be interrupted. And whether that interruption is something that is feeding into the exercise, or correcting the exercise, or analyzing the exercise, I think that I see that expectation continuously in the student's body, in the actor's body. And when it doesn't arrive, there's almost kind of a confession of surprise, of wonder. There've been multiple times when actors have come to me and said, why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you correct me? I knew I had got that wrong. Why didn't you? You know, so that sense of, which feeds back into this thing that I was talking about, of the velocity of expectations. Like, how much are you kind of expecting from this current moment? And that's something I've been really sort of grappling with, because I think a lot of students, a lot of actors that I've worked with in the last 2 years end up being bemused by the slowness, bemused by the lack of interference, or the lack of interruption. I wanna just wrap up these kind of, very rambling thoughts with two things. One is a small sort of anecdote from one of these learning spaces, and the other is to just respond to the frame of this chaos, or the chaotic moment that Jehan talked about earlier. The first is that with Drama School Mumbai, I was working with them on Uncle Vanya, and Um, a lot of our work was working with some of Stanislavski's principles, but working through them in a lot of improvised, not necessarily staging the text, but using principles of the text, or building, using principles of Stanislavski with the text and working in improvisation. And improvisation is a very open space. And so there was one particular incident where an actor who was playing Vanya went into a scene with his classmate who was playing Astrov, and they worked on the improvisation and the scene completed. And then the actor confessed to me later that he had gone in, because there were certain questions and provocations that they had gone in to the improvisation with. And he had said he'd gone in and realized that his co-actor had come in with very different decisions about his own character and the space. And that he wasn't prepared for that clash. And that clash kind of dismantled what he had come in with. And he seemed very distressed by this. He seemed very upset by the lack of sort of coincidence of the two of them having, or the lack of harmony between their decisions. And what happened for me was I had to confess to him that I found the scene immensely watchable for this reason, because I could see the tension that created, the irritation that created, and the recognition of a position of being unprepared. And it doesn't matter that it was, to me, it doesn't matter that it was particularly useful for that scene and for that character, because for me, like, Vanya is just continuously unprepared for his life. And so it came across very beautifully. But it also, when I was thinking about what to share today, it also made me think of, and this is another lesson perhaps from the pandemic, and I'm sorry to keep returning to that, because we are trying to kind of trying to make dialogue in what we at least want to imagine is a post-pandemic kind of space. But is that, how does one prepare to be unprepared? And I think that this is a vital thought for me in the theater space, because what it is jostling with is the second thing that I wanted to talk about, is what is the chaos of this moment. And the word chaos generally evokes the sense of a collapse of order, or a logic. But is it possible that the current sort of chaotic moment that we occupy actually is the presence of too much logic and too much order, that works too quickly and too efficiently and too insistently, and is less reliant on ambiguity and improvisation and doubt? I mean, I think that's that's a quality of the chaotic moment that I face in classrooms. Is I feel like there's too much structure, too much schedule, and all of this is kind of feeding in for me into the velocity of expectation that students have, or teachers or practitioners have of themselves. The thing to be achieved, the report to be written, the Jahan is laughing, but yeah. So I mean, that's a provocation with which I would like to end. I mean, I have other things that kind of floating about my head, but I'm sure they'll come out in conversation. But yeah, just to wrap up, it's the coincidence of these 4 experiences and working with very different students, but finding these commonalities from them and from myself, that made me interested in being here in the room today. So thank you, Jehan, for that opportunity. And I hope there's something to be made and connected from the random things that I've shared.
No, thank you for that completely. I just love the description of how those 2 pieces of wood in your basement ended up staying through a common understanding that wasn't necessarily articulated, but felt and received. And for me, it's almost like, okay, we're going through this place of turnover, spring cleaning. These stay, they just stay. And the idea that inherent in there is because of because of the recognition of the utility, the multiform utility of those two pieces of wood, and their universal applicability into whatever situation is going to be thrown at us next. It almost gave me a sense of actually staying in balance and staying in stability, or actually picking up a tool with which to walk into the unprepared space. So you kind of have in a beautiful way, I know you called it ramble, but I'm keeping a track of it, and it's very key. You've already shown us somewhere the preparation to be unprepared by somewhere just knowing from possibly a body of experiences what work. The second thing that I think I'm really taking away from this is the approach to the collection of those experiences and removing it from that paradigm of a destination or a place to be arrived at. And coming back to this idea of it's a process, an ongoing thing. It's not static, it keeps going, and we keep figuring it out as we go along. And I think that that's also a seriously strong takeaway for me. I was talking to you in the pre-talk, and this, I don't know, I think there was a misread on my side, because I've been thinking about the classroom as a place of contestation, even about the material. And I'm just now riffing and thinking out loud, where I felt like the classroom itself is now becoming unstable, necessarily so, because the classroom was a held space for me, where I knew certain things were going to happen and we were going to go on certain explorations and we would figure it out as we go along. But there was a certainty as a faculty member that I kind of knew how to hold this space and take these students on this experience. But you and the disruptions I was thinking about were the kind of challenges they were throwing back at me, because they are coming from a world outside of much higher velocity of change in their own lives, much higher velocity of consumption of experiences. And so for me, the held space was becoming wobbly. The held space itself had to now become, it was like playing on a water, like walking around on a waterbed, to, and still trying to figure out how to make it work. And for you to bring in this idea slightly differently, but maybe not, I don't know. I don't know. That they're coming in with a velocity of expectation. And then all the ideas that are already in the room, and this idea of chaos being actually too much order trying to work at, too many ordering systems trying to work at the same time. And then I was laughing because I thought you would go into like the different kinds of pedagogies that might be at work in the room. And then you went to like timetable structure and reports. So that's why I was laughing.
Yeah, but timetable is pedagogy. I mean,
fair.
In a way, yeah.
Absolutely. And like, does the timetable even have a place anymore if the classroom itself is, we're going to learn in a mode of chaos? But then what is chaos? Is it there's too much going on, or is the chaos of an uncertainty, nebulous kind of chaos? This I've never framed. I mean, this is a beautiful framing, and I don't know what other people in the room are thinking of when they hear it. But the idea that chaos is actually too many ordering systems coming into play at the same place is a beautiful framing, and I don't know how to unpack that further. But where then, Neel, have you found, because you were using Uncle Vanya as an example, and you were using that scene that the two kids, then you got enjoyment from it. But what was the generative capacity, or what was the thing, what was the moment of new creation and new discovery for them, for you, for the class as a whole? And how would you want to keep reorienting your work in these quote unquote training spaces to maximize and to be more prepared for creating those learning moments in the chaos that you and I have sort of jointly described now?
I suppose one of the things that I'm always wary of, both in creative practice and in working in a classroom, is that the moment the relationship is a teacher or a trainer equipping a student, what sometimes has happened for me is, because you very easily move into the vocabulary of sort of tools and things like that, is that being equipped itself seems to be the place to arrive at. And what I have often discovered in the classroom is, after discussion and vigorous note taking and reading and analyzing, is that there is always the sense that, okay, now we are prepared, now we know what to do. And the truth, as all of us have experienced, is the moment you move into an exercise or a rehearsal, those things kind of really seem to kind of fall apart. I mean, the very literal picture of that is just walking in to kind of fix a table with like 20 different tools in your hand, and then you actually have to kind of bend down to do it. Everything falls out of your hand, and then you can't decide which one to use. And I find this happening a lot. The more vivid and accomplished a student's vocabulary becomes, the more difficult it seems for them and for me to kind of present ourselves to a moment of being unprepared in an exercise, or a moment of discovery through doing. I mean, what is the doing in the classroom? Often at the NSD and at DSM, and I think the one exception to this space is Agas, because they don't come to the theater from a space of sort of conceptually understanding what the theater is and what the theater does before they go into play. They go into play, and actually this conceptualization is a new thing for them, is something that they're experiencing now and grappling with. But with the other students, often, you assign an exercise, or in the Drama School Mumbai, there is this weekly creation task that students have. And, you set the task on a Monday, and they present or perform on a Saturday. And there's been a number of times where students have come up to me, it's like, I've been thinking this, and we've been planning this, and this is what we're thinking of doing, and this is how we expect. And I've often just had the urge, and sometimes I have done it. I noticed one of them is in the room. Anyway, I've often had this urge to say, but just do it, just try it. Because the moment you do it, the 17 things that you've thought of will reduce themselves to 2. That's pretty much all that you will really be able to focus on in that moment. And then you won't know about those 2 things unless you do them. And it sounds like a very basic instruction, but I think that it's the thing that, for me as a teacher, and the students I've worked with, find it hardest to do right now, because somewhere in the sort of crack between language and actual physical practice, or in the time between, because a lot of the things that I've been talking about are sort of temporally oriented. I mean, I've talked about duration and slowness and things like that. And one of the things that's the problem, I think, is time. Is one of the things that's getting lost in this, is the actual doing. And that's, for me, is the site of you asking, where's the discovery happening? Almost always for me, it's not in analysis or planning, which one can see as the two sort of different parts. Like, I don't see myself planning for a discovery. You create a frame within which a discovery can happen, and then you realize or you recognize the discovery that has happened. I was thinking earlier today that the French sometimes use the word realize, or however they pronounce it, for direct. I mean, at least in film, directors are often called realizers or realizators or whatever. And the idea is to realize something, which seems less definitive and less product or goal oriented than than produce or direct, which are both sort of, they're such pointed kind of words. The words themselves, I think, carry that velocity that I was talking about earlier, whereas the word realize seems to be something that unfolds in space, in time. And that's something that occurs in the moment of occurring. It isn't about what is planned before or what is read afterwards, that, oh, you did this and that's what, I think it's that the ability that's always the most engrossing moment as a theater teacher and as a practitioner for me, is when you recognize that something is happening in front of you that you were unprepared for. You didn't prepare for this thing, which is why it is new, which is why it has been found. Sorry,
So,
that
no, it does.
Sorry.
No, it does. I don't know why you're apologizing. I'm feeling very enriched and thinking about this. I would just want to further just sort of stay with this thread for a bit, because I've just something more. Is okay, there's the velocity of expectation. There's everything you talked about in terms of that tool, that everyone running up to the table to prepare with 17 tools and 17 tools that you spent a lot of time learning to pick up and use and spend all your time trying to do that, because these tools will help me for whatever comes down the road. And I'm just thinking that now this, that they should spend time more with just the doing, that they should focus more on the ability to recognize the moment of creative potential that arises from the doing, which requires, the tools still play some role. Now, I'm just thinking about from a student's point of view, is it just a natural standard journey we all have to go on, a rite of passage, that we first feel the need to prepare and equip and do all of that, and then go through this very natural cycle of then showing up for the show and realizing that all of those are going to fall apart and having to figure it out in the moment from scratch? Is there something that we who are framing the spaces can do? Do we even have to do it? Because you said, let's go slow, but I'm going to counter that. Is there something that we can do when framing the spaces of learning that get them to maybe skip some of that unnecessary journey and get to finding those realizations and those doings? And I use this word deliberately: faster, earlier, sooner. Or is this just something we sit there and go, hey, we've slowed down, we're going to stay slow, and we're going to just wait for you to slow down with us. We are going to be the thick gravy into which you rush and then realize that you're stuck in molasses, and we're okay with that, and eventually you'll be okay with that. I don't know. Do you think that you could approach your classroom differently?
Honestly, the premium that we place, and certainly I feel like a certain generation of practitioners that is kind of emerging today places on quickness, efficiency, and completeness, is certainly for me something to be questioned. So, for example, in your question, I don't think it's incumbent on us to offer a kind of speed or a quickness of arriving somewhere, because to me the teaching and kind of training has always either been coincidental to the time of practice of making, or if not, then a prelude to it. So there's no arrival at the end of a training process. There's continuation, and it's in that continuation that you have to find. So whatever, some of your training is in your body, so it isn't necessarily sort of toolkit. It's just, sorry.
No, I want to qualify what I said into more relativist terms rather than. We were talking about yesterday during the pre-talk, we were talking about how we have to look at our age and our experience in the theater world not being as arrived at senior artist, arrived at junior artist, arrived at, young emerging, but actually it's all relative to people elder to us, relative. So when I talk about a speed or something, I'm just saying relative to, okay, let me requalify again. So for me, learning is lifelong. You're never going to arrive at being learned. We know this. I mean, I want to frame it as that. And so there's no destination of the learning, but what one can try and do in the urgency of a 1-year course, for example. And now I'm being very selfish because I'm hoping this conversation will make us think differently about what we do. And I think this is really rich that way. The idea is to give them as much, I don't know what that means, of a capacity to be lifelong learners and to build that relative to not having that, or relative to doing it slower. And if we say that at the DSM, for example, or at the NSD, we have taken our time in this way, I think my pointed question to you now is, Neel, you've had this experience, you've spent the last 2 and 3 years in this thing. You're going to go into a classroom 3 months from now again and start on a journey with a group of students. What are you shifting for yourself in terms of your practice of teaching, your practice of practice? What is that going to be with them that is different, that allows you to do what you're wanting to do better?
Yeah.
Because you want to do better, right? You don't want
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
So what do you want to do differently towards, in the direction of what you are talking about here? Does that,
I mean,
that question,
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, just, yes. But, and to respond to what you were saying earlier, to me, the problem necessarily is not how much is packed into, for this particular example, for example, DSM's 1-year program. Okay, it's not how much is packed into it. It's how do you treat everything that you've experienced? Do you treat it as a complete toolkit, or do you treat it as something that's necessarily incomplete, and to treat incomplete in the most generous way possible as a word, and incomplete, therefore move forward, continue, take this forward, apply it to practice, apply it to performance, apply it to the doing. And I think that that's the thing that I want to be able to realize in the classroom, is that how does one take sort of provocations in the learning space or discoveries in the learning space, and keep them continuing to generate generating sort of multiple arrivals, multiple findings, multiple realizations. And I think that, and this is not a problem with, and I think this is a problem generally with education, and kind of sort of testing models and the rubrics that we apply to all education, that the idea that you pass tests, or that you acquire degrees, or you acquire, sort of labels or whatever, I think those are misleading, because rather than being sort of signposts to a longer kind of experience as an actor, as a student, they seem to be, I mean, I find it very dangerous when somebody says, I know something, like, I know viewpoints, or, it's far more comforting to me when somebody comes into a space and says, I don't know. I mean, I have this kind of experience, but I don't know. Even when actors have tools, like often it happened in DSM, for example, we were working with Stanislavski's 7 questions. And, it's very easy to understand what they mean. But the moment you're kind of applying them to a character or to an exercise, it's interesting for me when an actor says, okay, I don't know what's happening here. I don't know how kind of to find the objective in this moment, because that's a forward movement. And I think that one of the process tracks that I've arrived at in teaching is a kind of sequence of words, but I don't mean them to be taken in a linear sense, which is question, experiment, proposition, choice, repetition. Uh, I'll write them down in the thing in a bit. And I have to continue. I have to insist to the actors that don't think of this as a straight line where choice or repetition are seen as kind of final goals. So you arrive at a fixed choice and then you repeat that fixed choice, but repetition can lead you back.
And you don't have to do
the question.
You don't have to do any of those steps one after the other. You can just
yeah. And I feel like as long as you're there, where you see yourself in a kind of in a process, and process implies duration, that takes place over time, as opposed to end gaming and finding those full stops, or finding those certificates almost.
I love it. It's like what you just described as the antithesis of like a PowerPoint process doc, where they just like take those things off, and I just love it. Listen, I'm going to open this up because we're getting some really interesting inputs. Deepika, please, if you can, these last two inputs, I think it would be lovely to hear it in your words, and just take your sort of thinking out loud a little bit further, because that's why we're all here. So Deepika, if could you step in and talk about this, this idea of slowness, etc.
Sorry, I can't come on camera. Actually,
that's fine. Just talk. It's fine.
Maybe I can. Just hang on.
Whatever makes you comfortable.
Oops. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks, Neel, and thanks, Dhyan, for having this. It's been super nice to engage with it. I did a screen test, an antithesis to everything we've talked about, which is why I was anyway. But this idea of slowness, and I was just thinking, I was actually writing in the chat about, it's also around what you can commodify, right? And we've been talking so much about slowness and non-arrival and duration, and I've also been thinking about this. Yes, of course, capitalism, and yes, we live in that system, so you can't design yourself out of it, but what can be finished can also be sold. And I feel like we still hold that little space within the theater where you cannot commodify a thing, a stillness, a slowness, and it's very much related to the body as well, like how linear, no, I don't know how to say that, like how the dancer's journey is, for example, and how you develop technique, how it becomes part of your body, how you develop vocabulary, and then you start to conceptualize something, but then you go back to the very basic. You don't do the split and you don't do the cartwheel on stage. You want to go back to like walking really slowly and finding time, and finding your relationship to space. And I just feel that being able to draw from these things has been useful in understanding time and learning, and has sort of lessened that or has eroded the urge to arrive at something, whether it's in something as small as an exercise in the theater, or as a career trajectory also, like, because they're not entirely exclusive. I hope I make sense.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that there are, to be fair to Neel, there are many theater teachers here. There are many directors and theater makers here. And I'm just wondering about what your thoughts are, responses are, and how you find yourself adapting to these classrooms that are more chaotic, or these processes that are more chaotic, or and maybe helping Neel further in his investigation. It would be really lovely to hear your thoughts. And this is where I hold silence with a lovely quote by Tolstoy, which said which I love, and I've been using it very often these days, is the two most powerful warriors are patience and time. And I've been loving that for a while now. It's helping me in all kinds of parts of my life, including my therapy, Deepika. So I think you're absolutely right to talk about parallel processes. Yeah. Oh, we can. This is the section where we can stop the recording because we've had the meat of this, and you'll find that Falguni over here writes a lovely reportage piece, which will be available on the website. But let's keep the conversation going. We will continue till 15 past the hour in other time zones and quarter to the hour in our time zone. And after that,